Yeah, okay. So our group is Group 1, we're Bear Valley, and our presentation is on decolonizing intergenerational trauma, a comparison of Western Indigenous treatment and two-eyed seeing approaches. The table of contents is here, so I'm just going to start with the intro, which is the introduction to intergenerational trauma as it's presented in the paper. So historically, Aboriginal peoples are probably the most disadvantaged group in Canada. There's so many aspects that go into their intergenerational trauma: suicide rates, homicide, abuse, domestic violence, and also historically, they've also had poor physical health, mental health, and they're less likely to complete their education, and because of that they might have reduced employment opportunities as well. So because of all this, they've been kind of treated unfairly in the research process, and the reason why it's so persistent in Aboriginal populations is because sorry is because typical Western science treatments for trauma do not understand Indigenous healing methods or cultural practices.
Just as sort of a control group, we decided to talk a bit about the unmanaged or untreated intergenerational Indigenous trauma. So as you can see, I just have some stats up there. Something that was greatly responsible for Indigenous intergenerational trauma was residential schools. Within a study of Indigenous youths who have at least one parent who attended residential schools, 37.2% had a parent who dealt with thoughts of suicide, 26.3% struggled with suicidal ideation themselves, and 31.4% reported experiencing symptoms of depression. Canada-wide, 25% of the Indigenous population are reported to deal with addiction, which can often result as an attempt to self-medicate and deal with this trauma that they've experienced.
Okay, so I'm going to first move on to the Western approach to intergenerational trauma as it was presented in the paper. So there wasn't any clear definition of Western science or how they were utilizing it. There wasn't any mention of like a hypothesis or a research question or anything like that. They kind of went straight into their research methods that they used. So they did use both data analyzation in the form of a t-test, and they also had research methods that they used. So the research frameworks themselves weren't distinctly Western, which I think is a good thing actually for achieving two-eyed seeing. And so their approach included a philosophical, theoretical, and methodological side to it. They did also use data analysis by using their results from their semi-structured interviews and their questionnaires, focusing on trauma and drug abuse. They had 4 main tests that they used, focusing specifically on addiction and trauma-related diagnostic tests. And the result scores from the data collection were analyzed by a t-test. Moving on to the strengths and weaknesses of the paper in applying Western science. The strengths is they had a very strong methodology and they were very strict, or not necessarily strict, but they did stick quite closely to what they followed, and that they used these structured interviews and the diagnostic questionnaires and the statistical analysis, which was great. In terms of weaknesses, I did notice that they didn't really provide any of the quantitative data that they received. So there wasn't a lot of transparency on what data that they had or didn't have. So because of that, there wasn't that many figures or graphs, and because and they didn't really have a hypothesis or research question that they presented. Morgan, you're up.
Sorry about that. I forgot to unmute myself. We looked at another paper to get an idea of how the Western perspective views intergenerational trauma. It was a study conducted in 2020, and 13 psychiatrists were asked a number of questions about their thoughts and opinions on dealing with intergenerational trauma. There were 4 main themes found in their answers, which are having awareness, meaning that they found it important to acknowledge the trauma and that it's passed down through generations and that it has cultural roots often. However, many of the participants mentioned that this makes them worried to kind of deal with it with their client to out of fear of furthering these power dynamics. They also mentioned feeling powerless, meaning that they didn't feel like they were able to make a good impact on their clients who dealt with intergenerational trauma. They also talked about thinking differently, meaning that they were acknowledging that different approaches had to be taken in order to deal with intergenerational trauma than traditional approaches to deal with trauma. And the last theme they noticed was looking backwards and forwards, meaning that they must acknowledge that trauma stems from generations back, which is the looking backwards portion, and that if nothing changes, it will be passed forwards onto the next generation as well. The strength I noticed were that the cultural roots were acknowledged and there was an understanding of past and future trauma. However, I noticed that there were many more weaknesses, generally, that psychiatrists felt that intergenerational trauma was not well defined within a clinical setting, and so they don't feel well equipped to deal with it, even believing that they may be doing more harm than good, which you can see in that quote on the bottom left there. Overall, it's pretty clear that Western science doesn't have a great grasp on intergenerational trauma as a whole.
Okay, so I'm today. So right now, I'll be highlighting the transformative impact of traditional healing practices on the participants' emotional well-being and through in Indigenous eye um, for the article. So the success and triumphs that I found were that the program integrated, and the article itself integrated the 7 grandfather teachings: wisdom, love, honesty, respect, bravery, humility, and truth to guide sessions, including boundary setting discussions. Traditional healing practices were also integrated, such as smudging, sweat lodge ceremonies also played really pivotal roles. These sweat lodge ceremonies restored participants' spirits, while elders shared teachings about healing and invited participants to open up about their experiences. So the methods did resonate with patients as well. And so central to this approach were the sharing circles. And this ties to community and ethical relationships. Many participants felt shame and guilt for seeking help while struggling with substance abuse. So these circles provided a safe and culturally adaptive space to address topics such as anger management, self-care, with the elders' guidance, fostering reflection. And the involvement of the Aboriginal Advisory Group ensured the program was ethically grounded, transparent, and aligned with Ojibwe, Algonquin, and Cree values. And this trust between the two eyes fostered deeper connections, which also made participants comfortable and embracing and claiming their identities.
Okay, so moving on, addressing intergenerational trauma through an Indigenous approach presents unique challenges. One key question is how these methods address the biological and neuropsychological impact of trauma, such as stress on the nervous system or inherited change in gene expression. These aspects often require insight from Western science to complement traditional practices. Another challenge lies with younger Indigenous generations living in westernized settings. Can they fully connect with traditional practices like ceremonies or land based healing? Ensuring these approaches remain relevant may require adapting them to urban lifestyles while preserving their cultural integrity. Finally, trauma often stems from systemic issues like racism and poverty. While Indigenous approaches excel at building community resilience and cultural identity, tackling these larger societal pressures may require collaborations with Western systems and policies. Moving on to the main steps that could be taken to improve the Indigenous approach is firstly, we would suggest having a program which allows for multiple generations to engage and break cycles of trauma, especially for youth coming from westernized settings. Um, Using certain Indigenous techniques like storytelling and different teachings, this will allow for youth to engage and earn more cultural education, which could help them overcome intergenerational trauma through the Indigenous approach.
And so, given the success, given the successes of the methods used for the participants, we kind of adapted to, for next steps, thinking about border implementation. So we would like to scale or hopefully scale this treatment and the treatment methods on a larger scale, scaling these techniques to larger communities while adapting them to diverse Indigenous knowledge systems. And sustainability is also key here, requiring ongoing culturally sensitive training for healthcare workers as well, and ensuring the development of this as well. And lastly is just addressing systemic barriers. So it's very important to address and tackle socioeconomic and systemic biases that affect Indigenous communities across Canada. And again, just diversify the treatment depending on the communities that are targeted, or the methods are targeted against too. Thank you.
Okay, and finally, this is the two-eyed seeing approach to intergenerational trauma. So this paper's goal is exploring the ways that Aboriginal practices can be incorporated into the seeking safety models. It's an exploration of how these practices are used and provides clear instruction on how to perform them, as well as how it contributes to a two-eyed seeing model. It gives a good description of the problem as decolonization and frames the use of two-eyed seeing as a meaningful step towards decolonization, as the inclusion of Indigenous research methodologies is critical to confronting particular epistemologies in the academic worlds. It also describes how decolonization as a process is a meaningful way to treat substance abuse and intergenerational trauma, as it is a commitment to Indigenous people and the right to self-determination, not only from an economic or political viewpoint, but with respect to research. It also it describes also how the use of the two-eyed seeing actually made an impact on the individuals within the study from a qualitative measurement, but as a strength of it, as with respect to its weaknesses, it has a particular lack of qualitative data, as it does not define any comparison to the before and after the treatment. So while it does provide qualitative measurements, such as the PTSD trauma symptom severity and the drug and alcohol problems, it does not give measurements for each of the individuals before and after treatment. It also is fairly vague about the impact of the incorporation. So, for example, while, as I said before, it does use many methods from Western science, such as thematic analysis, and then incorporating some of the Indigenous knowledge by consulting elders, where a medicine wheel was identified. It does not go over why or how the medicine wheel was integrated into the actual treatment and why it was important. And so what next can be done by the paper in order to further the use of a two-eyed seeing approach? First would be to demonstrate how the incorporation of the medicine wheel impacts the treatment method with respect to the seeking safety model. The second one would be to generalize it for other themes. So sure, the medicine wheel is important for treatment, but how can the medicine wheel be applied further? How does its theme help future victims of intergenerational trauma and substance use disorder? And finally, what would also help would be creating a standardized qualitative data set between different treatments, so that it is very obvious how those treatments have made an impact and in what way.
All right, and just a very brief summary. First of all, you'll see the medicine wheel that was discussed here. You can look at that in a little bit more detail a little bit later, just because there's a lot of information on it. But to briefly summarize, this paper, we thought, effectively integrated both the Western and Indigenous eyes of two-eyed seeing to create a more effective treatment of intergenerational trauma within Indigenous peoples. The Western eye was used more for the analysis of empirical data, while the Indigenous eye was more so used to create an environment where the participants felt comfortable to share and work through their trauma. As a whole, we felt this study produced positive outcomes, and a two-eyed approach to intergenerational trauma should be used further. And that is everything.
Okay, thanks very much, Bear Valley. And Paul, do you have any thoughts on that presentation?
When we started down this road, I didn't really think that about the two-eyed seeing being related to medical. But yes, a very good presentation. One of the things that I would say is that going into bush, being in the bush, walking around in the bush is very health orientated kind of stuff. It kind of clears out your head quite a bit. And land-based models in terms of healing and trauma based in terms of addictions. We actually have a crisis on our reserve right now. We're in crisis mode with addictions, and we're looking at ways to do that. And land-based is one of those. And I would say that most beds go to police and firefighters. They get the top picks of any type of health related where there might be some help that Aboriginal could access, but most of those beds go to police and firefighters. So you kind of need your own specific Aboriginal land-based treatment. But yes, very good. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I like the comment about the challenge of I guess land-based trauma healthcare, the challenges of that with an urban off-reserve population. But yeah, Steve, anything you want to add before we go on to the next?
Just a couple things to note. First thing is decolonization, just right off the bat. It's in the title of the article, it's in the title of the presentation. And yet I think if I was to pick 100 Canadians and just randomly select them from the population and put them out there and ask them what they thought decolonization meant, what that word or that concept meant, I think that's something that Group 1 can think about, perhaps in their final written thing. Might be helpful to go back. Also, getting back to a point that we made before, this idea about Western methodology as opposed to Western science. And if we just for a second just take out the Western and Crawford's, kind of philosophical concerns when he says, well, west of what? But I'm interested, and I think the people in Group 1 would be wise to focus on the idea of very specifically finding out whether the authors of the article declared themselves to be scientists. Because if they were just saying it was a Western methodology, it doesn't mean that it is science. It could be implicitly. And if it is, the fact that they were using semi-structured interviews in this, I mean, that's a gold standard technique in social science. But I mean, that means then asking questions about the authors of the article if they themselves made the distinction between social science, natural science, medical science, all three of which need to be hypothesis driven to be science.
Good point.
Did you have any comments on that?
Lots of discussion, but we better, yeah, go ahead, Paul.
Oh, I was just going to mention that I had written down sexual abuse from the churches and all that sort of stuff that go on. That's another trauma kind of associated, which is prevalent. And what do you call the schools? When we were boarded out in the schools, that stuff took place. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.